Hey guys, it's Chris at the Ultimate Recycler. Today we're going to look at electroplating nickel. I've got quite a lot of restoration projects lined up down the track. This isn't one of them. This is an old gramophone that's been in the shop, but it was a good example to show you nickel plating on all these metal fittings. And when I'm restoring some things, the metal obviously goes rusty, and if we look at the latches on this cabinet, this is probably a 1920s portable gramophone, maybe early 30s, and nickel plating is going to be a great skill to have in restoration of these items because it takes them back to original and it restores a finish that's much better than rusty metal. I also picked up a lock here off an old cupboard. This is something that if I was restoring a cupboard completely, I might like to nickel plate. Nickel plating provides a couple of advantages. It gives a nice finish. It's a good ornamental finish. Beautiful. It's almost like chrome. In fact, that raises another point. About 1930 or so, most of this was all nickel plated, polished nickel plating. They didn't start chroming metal until around about then, and of course you go into the 40s and 50s, and especially with things like car bumper bars and everything, they chromed everything. But back in the earlier days, they nickel plated, and it's something we can do at home. Chroming is a much more involved and more dangerous process, so you wouldn't set up for chroming at home, but nickel plating we can do really simply with some readily found items. We don't need nasty chemicals. And I was saying the use of nickel plating, obviously it's to beautify objects, but also it protects the metal, stops it from rusting, and it can actually give a harder wearing surface as well. So it's a great process, I think, to learn. So in this video I'll take you through what we need and show you exactly how to do it. We'll just scan along here for a start. What we're going to use, I've just got some test clips there, some wire jumper leads. I've got a small charger which we will be using for the plating process, and it's only 4.5 volt low current. That's important for getting a good plate. I've got another charger here which is a 12 volt charger up to an amp, and that will be good to create our nickel acetate solution, which we have to do first. I have a piece of nickel which I bought off eBay. I'm going to cut a couple of strips off that. You need pure nickel. Some guys I was watching were using nickel welding rods. I think that works right. Some coins though are no longer pure nickel, so you have to be careful. I've got a bit of nice clean copper wire here for hanging the items in the solution. I've got a jar which I'm going to use as the plating tank with a lid because we'll save the solution. The solution, or electrolyte, is just simply made up of plain everyday white vinegar with a little bit of salt to help for the conductivity, and that's really all it is. We will be using some hydrochloric acid, used to be called spirits of salts, also known as muriatic acid. It's readily available at most hardware stores. I think it's marketed as a brick cleaner or concrete cleaner or something like that. We'll use that just to etch the metal because we need to make sure everything's nice and clean, ready for plating, and the distilled water is again just to rinse the metal off. So it's not very complicated at all. So let's get things set up and we'll get started. So I've managed to cut a couple of strips. I've got some good tin snips here. They made the job quite good. It's fairly tough to cut. It's not a soft metal. It's much like steel, and this is a fairly thin, I think it's about 1 mil. So I was able to cut it with the tin snips. Now I've got the strips attached to the ends of the leads in the jar there. If I had longer strips, I could just bend the top of the strip over the top of the jar and wouldn't need to worry about the clothes pegs. Also, if I was using nickel welding rods, same thing, they'll be long enough to go down the bottom. But by hanging them in there and putting the clothes pegs on the top, I can get enough depth so I don't have to have the thing brimming to the top with vinegar. I have to be very careful not to cover the clips in solution, because the clips won't be nickel. They could be steel, they could be brass, I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's not nickel, and we need to keep this whole process as pure as possible. So the purpose here is to get nickel ions into the electrolyte, into the solution. So what we're going to find is that the positive electrode, or the anode, will actually gradually be eaten away, and the nickel ions from the metal will end up in solution and give us a nice green liquid, sort of a pasty pale green liquid, and that indicates that your nickel acetate has nickel ions in it, and that's what we need as an electrolyte to then plate. So at this stage it doesn't really matter which way round you put the positive and negative, because both of our electrodes are nickel, but it's important to get it right when you're actually plating. So that's all we have to do, is pour some vinegar in here. The solution, once we make it, will then keep for, that's why I've got a jar with a lid, because it will keep for next time we want to plate, and gradually it will get a little darker green as the solution gets a little stronger, because more and more nickel ions will be in solution. So now we just need to put some vinegar in. So we'll fill it up most parts, so at least it covers most of the nickel electrodes, and as I said before, we do not want to go over the top of the, or at any stage get to the little clips I've got there, because we only want nickel submerged into the solution. I think that's pretty good. So now we're going to hook up our power supply, and then we'll add a little bit of salt in a minute. And I'm using the stronger power supply, the 12 volt one, to get a little bit more electricity flow, a little bit more current through the solution to help things happen a little quicker. And we won't use that one though when we're plating, because we want it to happen a little bit more gradual when we're actually plating, so that we get a nicer finish, and that's what we've got this other lower voltage charger for. We're up and running now. I've connected an ammeter in line just to show you a little bit extra current when we add the salt, but you can see even without salt we've got bubbling there coming off the negative electrode, which is excellent. It means it's all happening. But let's keep an eye. I'll grab, say, a decent spoonful of salt. I think one should do in this smallish jar, and we'll keep an eye on the meter. And there she goes, look at that. Give that a bit of a stir, and that's certainly increased our current draw, which is good, because that'll help everything happen a little bit faster. And it should only take, I'll give it a little bit of a stir in a minute, should only take an hour or so, and we should see a nice green colour forming in the electrolyte. So I've given it a good stir, and the current draws a lot more now, which is great. And look at the bubbling going on. She's really kicking on nicely now with the salt. So the salt in the vinegar, beautiful. Why do I suddenly feel like I want to eat a pack of chips? Alright, we'll leave it go for a while and we'll check back soon. So I've moved my operations inside because there's threatening rain outside, and have a look at our beautiful green liquid now. And we have a little bit of an issue, and what's happening is it's drawing more and more current. Now, when I first put the vinegar in before I had the salt, we only had about 160 milliamps. I added the salt and the meter sort of took off. The more I stirred it, the more it dissolved, the more current it was drawing. And remember, our power supply was only rated at 1 amp, and it's given up the ghost. It did nearly the 2 hours, but it now no longer works. So I've got another one going now, which can deliver 2 amps. We're actually just over that again. So I suspect as the solution, perhaps as more nickel gets into solution, it draws a bit more current. It's actually got warm. I know I have read that it was supposed to get fairly hot. I wouldn't call it hot, but it's certainly got some heat to it. Maybe that increases the current flow. Perhaps more and more of the salt dissolved. So it's something to be aware of, and this charger probably will give up the ghost too if I keep leaving it in. I think we've gone long enough now. We've got a good nickel acetate solution there, so I'll stop it in a second. But just a couple of ways to reduce the current draw. I've got fairly large electrodes as far as surface area goes, and they're relatively close together. So you could certainly reduce the amount of current by either moving your electrodes further apart, and that's not an option in my little jar. But if you watch as I lift one of the electrodes half out of the solution, the current draw drops off. So by reducing the surface area, we can reduce the amount of current. And perhaps the other thing is maybe not quite as much salt. I might have put a bit too much salt in initially. So there you go, just a couple of things to learn. But that certainly worked well. We've created a beautiful solution there. I'll turn this thing off now because I don't want to blow this other power supply. And there we go. The fizzing stopped. One other thing to show you before we move on to the actual plating process. I said one of the electrodes will be sacrificial, and if we look at this one, it's rounded the corners off there. It's starting to basically take the nickel away and putting it into solution. And I think if we look at the other side electrode, there is a bit of plating going on that one as well. So the nickel ions are transferring across, but we have a good colour solution there. Now, as I mentioned at the start, this solution will keep pretty much indefinitely if we keep the lid on it. And as it's used for plating, we'll get more and more nickel ions into solution, and it will actually get a bit stronger, which will give us a quicker plating times. All right, now plating. I had somewhere, here it is, an old key. It's a nice early cupboard key. It's got surface rust, and I thought this would be a good practice piece to see how we go nickel plating. And the critical factor with getting a good plate is preparing this, or the article you're going to plate. It has to be immaculately clean. We'll have to buff all the rust off it and give it a good wash to make sure there's no oily film deposits or anything, and then we'll give it a bit of a rinse in the diluted hydrochloric acid, which will etch it. And our plating finish will totally depend on how good we get the key looking before we put it in. So I'll probably take this key home. I'll buff it up with a wire brush I've got there on my drill. I haven't got a buffing wheel on my angle grinder yet, on my bench grinder, but I am planning to get one. And we'll get this key cleaned up nicely before we put it in. Okay, you just saw me buffing away there on my drill with a wire wheel. The keys come up very well, nice and clean. Absolutely no rust left on it. I've got a little bit of sandpaper in the top holes there to make sure they're all clean. Now, we still will need to give it a good wash, and I'll use the acid solution just to make sure that there's no oily deposits or anything. It'll help etch the metal to allow for a good plating. Even fingerprints on your job will muck up plating, so everything has to be meticulously clean. I've included this piece of copper that you saw me buffing purely as a demonstration piece. I'm going to polish this one up super glossy tomorrow, and what we'll do then is when we start plating, we can just dip this in and I'll show you how quickly it actually does plate. And if we get this really glossy, the plating should almost look like a chrome. So that was the purpose of that, really just for demonstration purposes. But I'm happy with how our key came up. That's great. Now, before you guys have a go at me about things, I've got to point out a couple of things. I was using Christine's gardening gloves because I couldn't find any. My workshop's still not set up properly. So don't tell Christine on that. I'm sure I'll put them back in the cupboard and I don't think she'll know. The old drill I've got here jammed in my bench vise, yes, it's a bit agricultural, a bit rough and ready. But I'm not set up in the shed just yet, and you know, just think how good my videos are all going to be when I'm set up properly. I have got a good bench grinder down there to set up somewhere, and if we pan around here past all the piles of rubbish that I still have to sort out, when I say rubbish it's good stuff, there's another little angle grinder in there, not an angle grinder, sorry, a bench grinder, which I'm going to set up with some fine grinding wheels. And if we pan over here past my anvil, there's another bench grinder on a pedestal there. So I've got to buy some wire wheels and some buffing wheels for all these projects I'm going to do. But as yet, they're not operational. So we've had to put up with an old drill in a bench vise. But that's okay. I'm good at making do with what I've got at any given time. And if we take the drill out of here, it's only a cheapie. I think this one may have even come in the e-waste. It runs a bit rough, but it still works fine. The old wire wheel was in a shed I cleaned out. It was a little bit rusty, but it still does the job. And underneath the old towel here, have a look at my nice purple and red Dawn bench vise. I got this out of a deal as well, and it had a nasty crack right through the neck there. You can see where the weld's gone. A good mate of mine, Mick, welded it up, did an awesome job. And then he goes to tell me that the only paint he had in his workshop was purple. So I'm not so sure about that, Mick. I think you're having a bit of a dig at me, but anyway, I'm quite happy with it. Does a great job. So that's all we have to do now. I've buffed these up. I'll take them to the shop tomorrow. We'll do some polishing. We'll dip them in some acid, and then we'll start the plating process. Back in the shop today, out the back, it's a miserable rainy day, so it's a good chance to do some of this experimental work and videoing. So we have our nickel acetate solution there. I've got it sitting in a fry pan just on low heat, just to gradually heat the solution up. And we have to be careful, I don't want to crack the jar, but apparently the solution works better if it's warm. When we were making the solution, it does heat up, so if you were going to plate straight away, it would be fine. But this is the next day and it had cooled right down. Okay, so our two little sample pieces here. I'll put the camera down. I have given this one a polish. You can see it's quite reflective. It's not really a mirror polish yet, but it's very close. I used some silver polish. If we wanted to get a really nice chromed mirror, like a mirror-like finish, I would probably need to go, rather from a wire brush to polish, I would probably need to go through a range of finer sandpapers to get the scratches out. But that's pretty good. So now I've got latex gloves on because we're going to be dealing with some acid shortly, and also we do not want any fingerprints on our workpieces. I've attached some copper wire to each. I didn't polish the key, I've just left it as it is because I don't really want it to be highly reflective. I think it'll be a nice finish when that's nickel plated. So I've got some alcohol wipes. They're isopropyl alcohol, and that will ensure that we have no greasy fingerprint marks or any oily residue on our samples. So we'll give them a good wipe over. And as I've said a few times, and everyone else that had videos on nickel plating says that preparation is the key to a good job. So if we make sure these are nice and clean, now we want to clean the key right to the top. It should have any fingerprints or oily marks off it. So now I'm going to give them both a quick rinse in distilled water. So that should be nice and clean. And now we have a hydrochloric acid and water solution, about 50-50. The acid I use, or the acid you buy from the hardware, isn't super strong anyway. I'm not sure of the exact concentration, but we'll just dunk that one in there for around about a minute. And then we'll do the same with the key. We'll give that a rinse off in the distilled water, and we'll put that in the acid solution for about a minute. Now we don't want it to eat in and, change the surface of our items. If we left that key in for very long, it would start to pit. So it's really etching. I think they call it an acid pickle, and it's really just to make sure that the surface is absolutely primed for receiving the plate. So I'll take them out shortly, and then we'll rinse them off again in distilled water, and then we'll try the copper piece in our plating tank first. Alright, our copper's been rinsed off in distilled water. We have the terminal connector there, the negative lead from our little charger, and we're using a smaller power pack this time because we don't want it to bubble and fizz like crazy. And that will be plating straight away. Now it won't take very long, and I'll take that right out now and just see if we can see anything's happening in a matter of seconds. And I'm not sure if you can see that, but we've started plating straight away. We've lost the coppery look. It's really hard to get that in the right light. That's probably good there. You can see that it's actually started to plate in that small amount of time. So I'll dunk this back in and leave it plate just for a little bit longer. I won't worry too much. This is just an experimental one. And one of the reasons you want to use low voltage is that high voltage produces a lot more bubbles, which can interrupt the plating. And extra low voltage can mean that the bubbles form less, but they sit there, and they can also interrupt the plating. So it's important also to move the piece around. It helps get the bubbles off it, and you get a nice even plate. Now you can also get shadowing, of course, because the back of this plate won't have the flow of nickel ions at anywhere near the same rate as the front does. So if I was plating this whole piece, and I will with the key, I'll be twisting it round, moving it around, and probably about a minute or so will give a pretty good plate. The thicker you want the plate, of course, the longer you're going to leave it in. Okay, let's pull that one out now. It's been in for a few minutes, and we'll give it a bit of a rinse off in our distilled water. I don't believe the nickel acetate solution is particularly nasty, but I'm not sure. I think I read somewhere that it may be carcinogenic. Whatever the case, it's good chemical practice to use gloves all the time and to rinse things in distilled water. Now, let's have a look at this. It's terrible lighting. Well, that's the back. Okay, you can see it has even plated the back. It's just, it'd probably be better to show this in natural light. But there's definitely nice plating on that side. I will take them outside in a tick and show you, but before we do that, we'll unclip the lead off this one. And we'll hook up to the key. Now, we want all of the key plated. And it's not going to look a lot different because it's kind of silver anyway. But it should look great when it's all finished. So we'll dip that in. You can see it's bubbling away nicely. We want to submerge it. Of course, our copper wire will nickel plate as well. And if I keep moving around and a bit of a twist every now and again, it helps push the bubbles off it. It should plate more evenly, and we shouldn't get any plating shadows on the back. So I will do this one for quite a while because I want a good plating on it. So I'll finish it up here, I'll rinse it off, and I'll take them both outside and show you in natural light and see what they look like. Okay, it's still raining out here. It's been a bit of a gloomy day, but here's our results. Now, they do show up much better in natural light, and you can see that the copper piece plated beautifully. I haven't tried to polish it. There are a couple of sort of wavy marks there, kind of like watermarks on there, but it plated really well. Even on the back side, it's probably not as thick, but that was only in about a minute, so you can see how quickly the process takes. Now I left the key in for about 20 minutes, and I turned it, I didn't jiggle it all the time, I left it sit and then I'd turn it round, and it's plated really nicely. And you can see, I don't know if you can see there, it's actually plated some of the copper, which we said would happen. Because we didn't polish the key, it has a sort of a little bit of a frosted look, but that's great. I mean, that's going to protect the metal. The nickel is much harder wearing, and I think that's a really nice job. I'm very happy with that. It's very satisfying to do this. Now I'm looking forward to doing a restoration on a gramophone I have, which has some really rusted parts, and I'd like to put in the time and effort and prepare them properly so that we get a nice, almost original finish. So I'll look forward to doing that. There'll be a video down the track sometime. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something out of this. I can now pack up all my nickel plating equipment, including my electrodes, and use them another time. And we've got our solution, which we'll put the lid on, and that will keep indefinitely. And as I mentioned earlier, it will increase in concentration of nickel ions the more it's used. And I'll put the acid water mix into a jar so it's safe. So there you go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.